by morning a decision, both bold and revolutionary. Bold because in this, our darkest hour, we dared to take the offensive. Revolutionary because that offensive was conceived, planned, and executed by the peoples of two nations. The time and the place had been agreed upon. The code name for the combined operation was acrobat. The two great elements were time and secrecy. 125 days in which to plan and launch an offensive from bases 3,000 miles apart. An operation involving hundreds of thousands of American and British soldiers and sailors. Millions of American and British working men and women, only by whose combined efforts could the plan become a reality, but from whom the plan itself must be kept secret. A few score men, no more, knew in its entirety the plan for this greatest of combined operations. In London and Washington, British and American officers were placed at adjoining desks to work through the days and nights of grinding toil that lay ahead, and gradually in the enforced daily intimacy.
Hello, I'm Choice Boston.
I'm Jack Onstott.
And I'm Nick Matera.
And this is the Operation Torch.
We're going to land in the second wave. As nervous and excited as I feel, I don't have a clue what awaits us.
The Battle of the North African Front, later known by the U.S. and other nations as Operation Torch, began on November 8th of 1942, when American troops landed at 3 sites in Morocco and Algeria in order to the front of Vichy France Axis powers that had been collaborating with the Nazis.
The American convoy. Southwest by west, the British. Nothing like these two armadas had disturbed the waters since the world was made. This operation, an operation that began some 4 months earlier in Washington, D.C. The President of the United States welcomed the Prime Minister of Great Britain. The gravity of the moment had brought them together. The lights burned all night that night in the White House, where the two leaders met with their combined chiefs of staffs. For this was the picture taking all too definite form in the minds of the civil, military, and naval leaders now locked in secret conference. 2 Axis spearheads were headed east. In the north, von Bock was hewing his way through the Ukraine to the Caucasus. In the south, Rommel was driving toward the Egyptian border. These 2 spearheads were intended to meet in Iran and head eastward towards India. In the Orient, Japan had occupied the coast of China, the East Indies, Malaya, and Burma, in preparation for the drive westward through India. If these 2 enemy spearheads were allowed to meet, Russia and China, except for their remote Arctic ports, would be completely isolated. Japanese raw materials and German production would be combined. The peoples of Europe, Asia, and Africa, 7/8 of the world's population, would be enslaved.
Later known by the U.S. and other nations as Operation Torch, began on November 8th of 1942, when American troops landed at 3 sites in Morocco, Algeria, in order to fight the Vichy France Axis powers that had been collaborating with Nazis. This was at the locations of the Western Attack Force at Casablanca, the Central Attack Force, which landed in Oran, and the Eastern Attack Force, which landed in Algiers. Fighting in North Africa started with the Italian declaration of war on the 10th of June, 1940. On June 14th, Great Britain entered North Africa by crossing the border from Egypt into Libya and captured the Italian Fort Capuzzo. A series of battles for the control of Libya and parts of Egypt followed, reaching a climax in the Second Battle of El Alamein, when British Commonwealth forces under the command of Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery delivered a decisive defeat to the Axis of forces and pushed them back to Tunisia. Operation Torch in November of 1942 was a compromise operation that met the British objective of securing victory in North Africa while allowing American armed forces the opportunity to engage in the fight against the Nazi Germany on a limited scale.
After undergoing 10 weeks of special training in England, Scheffel and the Americans under his command are now a part of a British provisional unit. It will be the ROTC Grad's first time commanding troops in battle.
The weirdest feeling I don't know why.
I don't know. I didn't ask.
The night before we were to land, I go below deck and chat with my men. They're acting like excited kids. I tell them to focus and stay ready.
The major combats would have been the generals that led each army in the initial landings, where it was Major General George Patton with 35,000 troops as the Western Task Force at Casablanca, Morocco, Major General Lloyd Frendenhall with 18,500 troops as the Central Task Force at Oran, Morocco, and General Ryder with 20,000 troops as the Eastern Task Force at Algiers, Algeria. Right around 75,000 troops were involved in the infiltration of the Axis-powered nation that only lasted 2 days. As the troops were a compilation of Major General George Patton's forces with 35,000 troops as the Western Task Force at Casablanca, Morocco, Major General Floyd Frendenhall's forces with 18,500 troops as the Central Task Force at Oran, Morocco, and General Ryder's forces with 20,000 troops at Eastern Task Force in Algeria. The initial battle only lasted 2 days as the main headquarters was captured at 8 o'clock p.m. on November 10th, 2 days after the initial landings of each squad. The General Africa Corps were commanded by Erwin Rommel, but he was better known as the Desert Fox, and earned the respect of both his own troops and the enemies he fought against. The British Commonwealth forces were under the command of Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, aka Monty, known for decisive defeat to the Axis forces and punished them back to Tunisia,
stopping the British in their tracks.
The convoy from America was heading east, the one from Britain heading south. At a given point west of Gibraltar, the British would divide. After 12 hours, the two halves would proceed in opposite directions. Then, the second half would reverse its course and follow the first, passing Gibraltar 24 hours behind. Thus, with clock-like precision, the combined operations would begin with simultaneous landings at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. Casablanca to protect our flank against an Axis attack against Spanish Morocco, Oran and Algiers to secure bases from which to press eastward.
Then the occupation of Tunisia, from which the U.S. could cut valuable supply lines across the Mediterranean. Next plan of action was to trap and destroy the Nazis' Africa Corps that was under the command of General Ronald, between our Allied forces and the British 8th Army. Thus, one arm of the Axis oppressive forces would be amputated, and supply lines around the Cape of Good Hope would be shortened by half through winning control of the Mediterranean. North Africa would become the United States, with bases from which to stab at the heart of the Axis citadel. These were the main objectives of the plan that was called Acrobat.
In London and Washington, British and American officers were placed at adjoining desks to work through the days and nights of grinding toil that lay ahead. And gradually, in the enforced daily intimacy, men grew to know and respect each other. Thus was born the relationship out of which an Allied army came into being. To them came hourly reports on the vast undertaking of forging the striking weapon. It was a race against time.
The British Commonwealth had a loss of 220,000 dead, wounded, missing, or captured. 478 confirmed dead. Italy had a loss of 22,341 dead or missing, and 340,000 captured. Germany had a loss of 18,594 dead, 3,400 missing, and 130,000 captured. The United States amounted losses were 2,715 dead, 8,978 wounded in combat, and 6,528 found missing. Tanks were abundant in the North African campaign because of the large desert environment. They were useful in traveling over sandy and difficult terrains, much better than jeeps or other automobiles. Several tactics were used in order to defend and flank armies and borders. There were often a lack of supplies because of the location. Supplies were difficult to transport to forces. The North African Front, or Operation Torch, played a huge role in the war and was a turning point for American involvement. It was the beginning of the United States' direct military assistance and also the start of attacks upon the Axis powers directed at Italy. Once the Allied powers invaded and secured North Africa, the Axis powers began to lose control. This led to the Italian campaign, which culminated in the downfall of the fascist government in Italy and the elimination of Nazi Germany.
But the Eighth Army's offensive was only one phase of a larger strategy. Included therein, the bombings of Genoa, Naples, Turin, bombings of the Renault factory, turning out Rommel's tanks. All these are part of the plan called Acrobat, of which the enemy still knew nothing. Nothing of the submarine trip to Africa by General Mark Clark, with a message to be smuggled into France. Nothing of the arrival at Gibraltar of General Eisenhower, where he was joined by General Henri Giraud, who had received General Clark's smuggled message. The enemy knew nothing until the last possible moment, when the first half of the convoy from Britain steamed past the fortress of Gibraltar. It was at night that the ships passed through the straits. The time had been carefully chosen, for here in narrow waters, attack seemed certain. Aboard ship and on the rock, everyone stood to, but the ships moved steadily on. It was as though, for the moment, the enemy's sword had fallen from his hand through indecision. This time, it was in Rome and in Berlin that the lights burned all night. For the first time since the war's beginning, somebody else was calling the tune. But before the enemy could collect its wits or its forces, our ships lay, as planned, off their appointed destination.
And that's all, folks.